Hello, my name is Mathew Oakland. I'm an associate teacher in the ninth grade in the upper school. I teach alongside Allegria the science and mind sections. I'm also a pre-K through 12 admissions associate. Today, I'm kind of just giving a recap of my Science Friday presentation, which was focused on bearing the brunt of disaster, mapping the impact of environmental racism in marginalized communities. Thank you so much for joining. So the story I'm going to tell starts with the Princeton Bridge Year program, which is kind of the beginning of my environmental awareness. Then we'll talk about what actually is environmental racism, how I define it, my introduction to the concept, how we can define it. It's going to lead us into the topic of extreme heat in urban areas, and then more specifically the urban heat island effect, or UHI effect. And then we'll analyze heat differences according to income and race, and kind of can keep in mind this term thermal inequity, and then ways to combat thermal inequity. So I'll start with spending 9 months in Bolivia through the Novogratz Bridge Year program. So these are a couple pictures actually. This is in the Bolivian Altiplano, so this is just kind of the high plains area. So this is mostly at above like 10,000, 11,000 feet. You can see these rolling plains, rolling hills. Couple more pictures. So this was actually the work I was doing. So while I was there, I was a part of the Novogratz Bridge Year program. So basically what that meant was my enrollment into Princeton was actually deferred for a year. So I was class of 2019, became class of 2020. And so in that kind of space of a year, I actually went abroad to Bolivia, specifically Cochabamba, which is one of the main cities, and spent about 7.5 months there, specifically working with a service site called Fundación Abril, the April Foundation in Spanish, or in English, in Spanish, Fundación Abril. And our focus was on kind of this urban gardening project, which you can see here that we would do with the kids next to this river that was contaminated that we cleaned up. And so that was a lot of fun. And then the other thing we would do is rainwater storage tanks. These are actually some of the smaller projects. So I built this here. This is actually what we would do with like the first and second graders, taking these kind of 2-liter kind of Coke Sprite bottles and then turning them into actually like little things that you can make plants with. This is where I would go to make rainwater storage plants. So this is actually kind of like the countryside of Bolivia. This is where the campesinos, the farm workers, work. And this is what the rainwater storage tanks would start as. So we'd actually like dig down and create these incredibly wide, incredibly deep areas for these rainwater storage tanks. I brought my pants there so you could see for reference. So it's, a couple feet deep. And this is what they end up looking like. So what they do is they kind of collect the rainwater that would come. And then these farmers who were dealing with these kind of droughts, which are really disruptive to the rainy seasons that Bolivia is used to, and just the practices, the ability to be able to farm obviously necessitates water and rainwater. And so this was in some ways to combat some of the difficulties of climate chaos. So what exactly is environmental racism? It refers to the processes that resulted in minority and low-income communities facing disproportionate environmental harms and limited environmental benefits. And that numerous studies have found that race is the strongest predictor of exposure and proximity to environmental hazards. There's also considerable evidence that there's direct links between racial segregation, exposure to these environmental hazards, and of course, poor health outcomes. And so what we want to think about when we're thinking about environmental racism is that the ways that we see the climate chaos operating and climate change happening and existing in the world will often cross along these lines, across these axes of power, of race, of class, and that is really important. And so that is something that I want to be kind of a main theme of this. So then kind of moving from environmental racism into the focus of today, extreme heat and why it's important. It has incredibly negative consequences for human health. So stroke, exhaustion, respiratory issues, cardiovascular issues, and these types of things, and extreme heat events specifically, and extreme weather events, but extreme heat specifically, expect to become more common and longer lasting as climate change drives temperatures up. So thinking about this kind of extreme heat, we actually kind of know that in urban settings that there's actually already a reason why they have higher temperatures than if you were in a suburban area or kind of in a more like countryside. And that is because replacement of natural land cover with these built up structures, as well as dense anthropogenic or human activity, increases local temperatures in cities compared to the background climate. This phenomenon is known as urban heat islands, or UHI effect. And since over 2/3 of the global population will reside in such areas, urban areas, by 2050, heat stress and its impacts will be a really important thing to study, and will impact a disproportionate fraction of us in the future. And so this is actually from Canadian researchers. This is actually kind of a visual of what this looks like. So you can see in the kind of residential downtown area, it's actually significantly warmer, while rural farmland and rural areas would be cooler, and that's because of dark roads, asphalt, dark rooftops, which retain heat, lack of trees, meaning less shade, and then heat's trapped in buildings. Sorry, I'll actually keep that slide for a second so you can get a chance to look at it. And so my main question is, to what extent does exposure to heat vary according to income and race? So even given the urban heat island effect, given that we know that this exists, and actually the urban heat island effect has been known since actually the early or kind of the early middle part of the 20th century, that they've been studying this effect that urban areas are hotter. But to what extent does that exposure to heat still within an area vary according to income and race? So not only the urban heat island effect, but who's affected within that kind of ethos. And so to kind of figure this out, what we'll be focusing on is the study of urban heat differences in 20 Southwestern metropolitan regions. So you can see my hometown, for example, Sacramento, nearby cities, San Jose, Fresno, and then a couple other places in Southern California, and then a few other kind of major cities, major areas in the Southwestern US. So these are the 20 cities that we'll kind of be focusing on today. You can kind of feel free to take a look. And so taking the example of Fresno, California, for example, if you can kind of just look at this. So basically what you can see here is, for example, the percent Latinx is strongest when you have these darker colors. This is the heat differences by day. So these darker red colors would be hottest, whereas these blue and like green would be cooler. And that's the same with the nighttime temperatures that they gathered. And then median income. So the lower median incomes would be these kind of yellows and oranges. These darker reds and oranges would be higher. So I'll kind of give you a second to look and see what you can kind of gather from these. Yeah, so what you should notice is that the percent Latinx is highest in these areas that are hottest, both day and night, and that there's significant temperature difference, as much as 4, 7, 10 degrees temperature differentials from one part of Fresno, California to another. And that also aligns with income. So not only are we seeing kind of these predominantly Latinx income, predominantly Latinx communities, but also lower income communities, and the kind of crossing of race and class, that those are not separated, but those are in a lot of ways intimately associated. And given that both of these communities are experiencing much hotter temperatures in their urban environments, even given this urban heat island effect. And so actually, to just kind of gather what they found in this study is that low-income neighborhoods do experience significant temperature differences compared to the wealthy neighborhoods in the exact same region. And so what this shows is that they took temperatures on an extreme heat day, so that's kind of in this pink, the average heat day, in this brighter orange, and then this nighttime, which is kind of this orangey yellow. And so the differentials are from the lowest decile group, so the lowest 10% in terms of income, and the top 10% in terms of income. And then the difference in that is on what's on this graph in degrees Celsius. And so, for example, if you're looking at Inland Empire, at night, you could be in Inland Empire, and it could be 4 degrees Celsius hotter where you are, just because you are in the lowest 10 percentile of income, compared to someone who might be in the wealthiest 10%. and that's during the nighttime. But even during an extreme heat day or an average heat day, the temperature difference is still 2.5 to 3.5 degrees Celsius, which would be about 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. So a significant difference. And so 10% decrease in income is associated with about 0.22 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature during daytime for both extreme heat and average heat days. A 10% decrease in income is also associated with 0.09 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature at night. And there are negative associations between temperature and income across all three temperature scenarios, meaning that higher neighborhood income does result in cooler temperatures. As well, so kind of remembering that one we saw earlier, which is the kind of example of Fresno, how much race and class can be aligned. Similarly with majority Latinx neighborhoods, so in the top 10 decile in terms of population of Latinx in a neighborhood, so the top 10% of Latinx neighborhoods compared to the bottom 10% in terms of how much they have a Latinx population in that neighborhood, there is also extreme significant temperature differences compared to non-majority neighborhoods. So if we kind of like look at LA, for example, on an extreme heat day, you might be 3.5 degrees Celsius or about 7, 8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter if you are in a predominantly Latinx neighborhood than if you are in a non-majority Latinx neighborhood. And so you can see that this holds across, there's kind of maybe smaller ones, for example, Dallas and a few other cities, but extreme temperature differences, significant enough to be 3 to 5, 6, sometimes even up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit differentials. And so kind of as a synopsis of what they found, large thermal inequities existed for all of the urban regions investigated. Low income and Latinx populations are the most impacted by these thermal inequities. And so when we think of thermal inequities, what that means, what the term denotes, is these differences in temperatures that we're seeing in these urban or suburban areas. So any temperature differential that you're seeing within the small part of certain neighborhoods of a region in the city. And on average, the top deciles of Latinx neighborhoods, so that top 10% in terms of Latinx population in a neighborhood, in each region were about 2.2 degrees Celsius, 4 Fahrenheit, hotter than the lowest decile neighborhoods in Latinx population. And so here's actually a map. This is from NPR. So they actually worked with a couple of different organizations and universities to conduct their own study on thermal inequity, which was last year. And these are the cities with the strongest correlations between heat and income. So the cities with the strongest thermal inequity or highest rate of thermal inequity. And so anywhere that you see, for example, these kind of darker red colors, that would be the hottest areas. And then these lighter reds would be the kind of like less hot areas. And then darker greens would be kind of higher income versus these light greens is lower income. And so what you notice with all these maps, but like if we're looking at Portland specifically, the kind of eastern side is dealing with far more extreme heat temperatures. And is also a far more low income community, whereas the higher income community of kind of Western Portland has much cooler temperatures. So how does this phenomenon of urban heat islands relate to environmental racism? So when we're thinking about this UHI effect that we know exists, we've known has existed, why does it relate to environmental racism? The answer, the thermal inequities we're seeing across these cities. And so what do you think are some of the causes of thermal inequities within US cities? Feel free to give yourself some time to think. Yeah, so some of the causes, if you remember from the kind of graphic before from the Canadian researchers about the urban heat island effect, there are some things that they mentioned there, but just to reiterate, lack of shade, lack of vegetation, and lots of paved areas are some of the main things. So green spaces with the cooling benefits appear far more frequently in high-income white neighborhoods, in dry urban regions than in low-income or non-white neighborhoods. However, even though white neighborhoods do have more tree canopy, Researchers have determined that Latinx and African American neighborhoods have a much higher potential for tree canopy, and that mitigation potential could be amazing and quickly implemented in these neighborhoods to cause kind of significant differences in these thermal inequities. They wouldn't fix it, but it would be a very big solution. So that is one thing that we can think of as a possible solution for these thermal inequities. And so actually to kind of give an example, here's the difference in tree cover in two Baltimore neighborhoods. The left is on the edge of Broadway East, one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, and the right is Roland Park, a cooler neighborhood and a much more affluent part of the city. Hopefully these videos load. I'll just give them a second. And so here you can see kind of on the left, there's very little tree line, and on the right, it is replete with tree coverage. And so what's another cause of thermal inequity? Actually, histories of redlining, also known as residential segregation. So this is actually an original redlining map of San Francisco. So kind of these red communities would be considered basically an F. So it actually was scaled by A through F, and you can think of it like a grading scale. And A is an amazing neighborhood, so that's these neighborhoods in green. B are these blue neighborhoods, so they're like pretty good. C is yellow, and actually, sorry, well, D or a D or an F would be these red neighborhoods. And basically, kind of these practices of defining neighborhoods by how much someone should want to move in were pretty much just based on racial lines. And so what communities often were redlined were based on the fact of how many Black and or brown, Latinx, Asian people lived in that community. And if it was a lot, then it was a red line. It was a way to signal basically to white homeowners and to white people trying to buy homes. Here are the neighborhoods you want to live in. These are the nice, better neighborhoods with more access, better homes, better trees, shade, all of these things that we're seeing now, than where kind of these red lines are. And so this practice was actually started in the 1930s and continued for many years, including these things called racial covenants, which actually restricted Black, brown, and other BIPOC folk, Black, Indigenous, people of color folk from living in these neighborhoods still exist in many leases. So actually, if you check your own lease for wherever you live, like if you live in San Francisco or maybe a nearby area, it's quite possible there still might actually be a racial covenant clause in your lease that says, oh, Black people or Hispanics or some sort of kind of honestly derogatory terminology cannot live in this house, in this neighborhood. They are no longer valid in many states and often just kind of aren't considered. But if you look, actually, many leases still contain those. And so actually in a 2020 study, Locke et al. Found that neighborhoods previously subjected to redlining have 37% less tree canopy, leading to warmer temperatures. So if you think about the video we just watched, that kind of, you can see that visually. And then a 2020 study by Hoffman, Chavez, and Pendleton, 108 US urban areas, found that 94% of neighborhoods that had been redlined, 94% had elevated temperatures compared to the rest of the city. So in formerly redlined areas, Americans live with hotter temperatures. In the 1930s, the federal government rated these neighborhoods according to mortgage lenders' risk, like I just said. So A being the highest, D being redlined. Sorry, it was A through D, not F. And you can see that the differences in average city temp and average neighborhood temp hold. So the communities that were listed as being redlined or who were at least rated lower in those kind of highest ratings experience, 6-7 degrees temperature differential compared to their kind of highly rated counterparts. And that is from a rating in the 1930s. So we're seeing how these kind of racially restrictive laws, these discriminatory laws, are continuing to play into the thermal inequities we see today. And so this is a quote by Richard Rothstein. He's a fellow at the Economic Policy Institute and author of a really fantastic book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which I recommend. And his quote is, "The policies of segregation that were followed by the federal government were so powerful to determine the racial landscape of today. African Americans are restricted to neighborhoods because the other neighborhoods are now unaffordable to them, restricted to neighborhoods where there are fewer trees, where there's more heat." And so to return to kind of that main question I planted earlier, to what extent does exposure to heat vary according to income and race? Significantly, measurably across cities. I actually was looking at similar studies, specifically some in like New York, where they were finding the same results for Black and Brown communities, especially in kind of the more dilapidated and or underserved communities. And that has a really significant um, consequence, especially for elderly communities who might not be able to afford to pay for air conditioning and can have serious health risks because of extreme heat events, including kind of heat strokes and possibly mortality. And so, how do we combat some of these systems and thermal inequity we see? Public heat refuges are really important. So this graph here actually shows different walking speeds. I think it's related to kilometers per hour that you could go. So even at a fast walking speed, what they deemed as like the fastest walking speed, only 33% of the population of kind of this part. This is Portland, Oregon. So only 33%, so or 32.7, about a third of the population of Portland, Oregon, even at a fast walking speed, would be able to get to a public heat refuge if there was a major heat event. And so that means 2/3 of the cities would not have access. And so it's really important to not only have public heat refuges nearby and accessible for people, but for people to have this knowledge, to know where they are, how they can access them, what they can get at them, the types of days where they might want to do those in advance, especially considering the kind of quote we had before, which is by 2050, 2/3 of us will live in these urban areas, and extreme heat events will be only more common, not less. And the other thing we can do is planting more vegetation. So this is just kind of like a stock image of a city, but having lots of trees, tree-lined streets, which provide shade, having materials that actually have the albedo is how much a surface reflects the heat back out. So having surfaces and structures where the albedo is specifically chosen so that like heat can be radiated out instead of kept in with buildings. Having less paved roads, those roads being not so dark, because that helps retain heat, which we do not want. So just really like planting more trees, vegetation is such an important part. And here's my bibliography. So thank you all so much. I hope that this has been informative, and that you've learned more about kind of how environmental racism is figuring into the communities that we live and love. I hope that you understand that this is something that is happening, in the neighborhoods that we exist in and the areas that are nearby us. And as we think about climate change and fires and the different things we experience in California, but also just thinking about extreme heat as something that exists across the US, this will be a really important topic. And so thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach me. My email is moakland@newhavenschool.org. Again, I'm Mathew Oakland, upper school teacher and pre-K-12 admissions associate. And I really appreciate you listening today. Thank you so much.